Thanks, everyone, for being here. I'm Jay Shambaugh. I'm the director of the Hamilton Project. I just want to, before we start, since this is the last panel, just once again thank Stanford profusely for partnering with us on this. The team at SIEPR has been fantastic. Mark Duggan and Lauren Barley did just terrific work helping us pull this event off here. Charles Kolstad moderating earlier and also contributed to the facts document that you hopefully picked up earlier. And Larry Golder, who has been just a great partner throughout the entire process of kind of organizing and building out this event, and also helped co-author the facts document with us as well. Just quickly to thank the Hamilton Project team as well. Kristen McIntosh, our managing director, and Melanie Galarski, our events manager, who it's very hard to pull off an event 3,000 miles from where your office is, so thank you to them. I'm not sure how they do it usually, and our whole team, as well as Ryan Nunn, who you just heard from, and Jimmy O'Donnell, who co-authored the facts document as well. So panel one was very much thinking the perspective of what could we do now even if there were no carbon price. Panel two was, in some sense, what should we be doing anyway? Regardless of what you do about emissions, right? You're going to need a lot more innovation. And so on this panel, what we're going to try to talk a little bit more about is what do we want a future of climate policy to look like? And in particular, if you did put a price on carbon, how might that change how things look? So just quickly, our panel here, we have Jerry Taylor, president of the Niskanen Center, Abigail Dillen, president of Earthjustice, Christy Goldfuss, senior VP of Energy and Environment at the Center for American Progress, and Rob Williams, professor at University of Maryland and chief economist at the Climate Leadership Council. And as you've probably seen by now, there are detailed bios of all of them in the program with all their many, many, many accomplishments. So the existence of this panel and this event suggests that we think climate change is important, and you're all being here suggests you do too. It's got potentially existential impacts, and even if it doesn't have existential impacts, just the economic costs are massive and justify action. And the question is then what actions and how much and how are you going to pick from those actions? And as mentioned on the last panel, economists often tend to vote pretty hard in favor of putting some sort of price on carbon. You had some like 3,000 economists signing a letter saying we need a price on carbon, we should rebate the money, and oh, by the way, if you do that, you'll probably change some of the other regulatory frameworks. And if you read almost any economist writing about carbon prices, there's either a footnote or a paragraph somewhere that says, and if you did do this, you'd probably change some other stuff, and we're not going to think too hard about that right now. And so Rob's paper that he wrote for this event and that you can pick up or read online if you'd like, really tries to dig into this last question of what would look different if you had a price on carbon. And so I want to just start off, Rob, turning to you, thinking how do you see this in your proposal and what are your thoughts on this?
Thanks everyone for coming to listen. The core argument here that price on carbon has to be the center of any economically efficient approach to dealing with climate change, and that you're going to wind up wanting to make a bunch of other changes as a result of that. That's sort of putting in a price on carbon is going to be a transformative solution, and it's going to change the way a lot of other things behave. So there's an economic argument for why you'd want to be getting rid of or modifying some other policies. It's essentially that the carbon price is going to trigger a whole bunch of actions, all of the low-cost actions. Anything that costs less than the carbon price, people will do. And that's going to make some existing policies redundant, that everything that they cause people to do is something that the carbon price does. In other cases, it's going to change the effects. It's going to do some of the things those policies did, all the low-cost ones, but it won't do the high-cost ones. And so if you keep those regulations in place, the effect of the regulation will be to cause you to do a whole bunch of high-cost stuff. And so it'll do less than it would have done before, and it'll cost more. So some policies become redundant, some policies become inefficient. And you probably want to pull those out. Now, the key caveat here is if there's some other market failure, then you want to keep a policy in to address that. So we just had a whole panel about knowledge spillovers. That's a really important market failure. Carbon price goes a long way to helping, but it doesn't solve the spillover problem. So you need policy there. There are also pollutants other than carbon. And to the extent that those aren't covered, you don't want to be pulling out regulations that go after them. But I will say, even in the cases where there's another market failure and you want to keep a policy in place, you may want to change that policy so it's better targeted at the remaining market failure rather than some compromise between addressing carbon and addressing that other market failure. So, for example, you move your renewable energy subsidies, instead of having them on building wind and solar, you move them upstream to new technology development. Instead of having a policy that is sort of a compromise between dealing with local air pollution and dealing with climate change, you focus it more on local air pollution, those kinds of changes. There's also a strong political argument here that the opponents of carbon pricing don't like carbon pricing, but a lot of them like regulation even less. And so there's a potential for a swap there where you pull out the regulations and put in a carbon price. Now that swap needs to be politically durable, and one of the things I won't go into a lot of detail about, but is in the proposal, is some details about how you make that more politically durable. Essentially, you suspend regulations rather than removing them and have them snap back into place if the carbon price is subsequently pulled out or substantially cut. The other key caveat here is you need a sufficiently high carbon price. Now, sufficiently high means different things. From the economic argument, it means having a carbon price that's in the neighborhood of the marginal damage, the damage that one additional ton of carbon in the atmosphere is doing to the world. From a political standpoint, it's enough to do more than your existing regulations that you're pulling out, so that it's a trade that benefits both sides. If your carbon price isn't high enough, then the case gets a lot weaker for pulling out regulations, and you'd pull out less. If you push the carbon price too high, which may sound like a silly thing to worry about, but it is theoretically possible, then you might want to pull out even more. So I don't have time to go into a lot of the detail of the proposal. I'll give a quick overview. I want to note that even though I talked about both economics and politics, the proposal is just focused on the economics. So it's a $75 a ton carbon price, rising at 2% above inflation every year. I propose suspending stationary source CO2 regulations under the Clean Air Act and CAFE standards and related fuel economy standards, repealing tax expenditures for fossil fuel companies and the renewable fuel standard, modifying tax expenditures for renewable energy, keeping a range of other policies, including motor fuel taxes, methane regulations, at least until you expand the carbon price to cover methane, and not doing anything to preempt state and local policies. State and local governments may want to change those, but I don't see any reason for the federal government to force them to. Reasonable people can disagree about a lot of the details, but I want to get the conversation at least started on those details. And I think the core principles, that you get rid of policies that become redundant or inefficient, and that both cuts the cost of what you're doing and makes it more politically feasible, that strikes me as a pretty important point to make. Thanks.
Great, thanks. Christy, I want to turn to you. So how do you see kind of policy evolving in some sense? What's the path to net zero emissions in some way? And do you see a carbon price having a role there? And if so, how does that affect what else is going on?
Thank you, Jay, and thanks to the Hamilton Project for having me here. Jay and I were in the White House together, so it was nice to see several friends about this. So when I think about a carbon price, I think it plays an important role. But one of the things that we haven't talked about much in this entire discussion, and I think it's been a long time as a DC person that I've talked about and heard climate discussed so much without the Green New Deal coming up. And I think it speaks a little bit to what Nat said in the first panel, which is you don't want to lead with your chin when you're talking about climate policy. What are the benefits that we are going to get out of making this transformation? When scientists last year came out with the IPCC report, the special report on 1.5 degrees, the policy discussions in DC did shift. The difference between targeting 2 degrees of warming versus 1.5 degrees of warming really meant that we have to use every tool in the toolbox. And a price on carbon is a key piece of that and can make us go faster, especially in the electricity sector. But as Mary Nichols said in the beginning, it doesn't do what we want it to do in the transportation sector, and it brings on a whole lot of opposition from other folks in the transportation sector. So I think the question is, what is the appropriate role for the carbon tax? And given this world that we're living in, where we're going to need all the tools in the toolbox, giving up regulations, is that the right approach? I think from the way we look at it, the Center for American Progress, we just put out our own report called 100% Clean Future. We state in there that giving up regulations, given this new reality, is not the right approach, because we are going to have to think about where are the other places that the carbon tax does not reach, and what are other ways that we get there?
Great, thanks. Abigail, I want to turn to you and just in some sense get a sense from you for what the frame you use to think about what the right climate policy is, and when you kind of design effective climate policy, how do you see that?
Well, I should start with my bias, which is I'm one of the people who raised their hands as a non-economist. I'm a lawyer, and it's proven very useful to have clear regulatory requirements that we can enforce. And by we, I mean people in the room who have a stake, who can enforce laws in the public interest, even when there's no political will to do so by our elected leaders. And so we're at a time where we've talked about how we have lots of good ideas, but we are often disconnected from our power to get those ideas in operation in government. And having this power of the law behind us gives us leverage. And so I hesitate to give away any leverage at this moment, and that's my bias. I also agree with what I think you were suggesting, which is overregulation is not the problem right now. And I am more skeptical than you are about the political advantages of giving away regulations, because I think when we talk about regulations that are targeting carbon, they're so inexpensive now that I think rolling them back is unlikely to buy support for more consequential, expensive price on carbon. I also think there is a practical danger of doing it, in that the common sense of the country now is that regulation is bad. And that is a toxic narrative, because we're at a moment where we need, just as the last panel demonstrated, for one, more government innovation, infrastructure investment. To your point, Christy, around the Green New Deal, we're at a point where a carbon signal standing alone will not get us to where we need to go quickly enough, and that we need to embrace some government intervention and public investment at a scale that we haven't seen in my lifetime. And so when I think about how we get to the policy suite, and Christy had just co-authored a great paper that really sets out all the kinds of policies that it will take to get us where we need to go, we think of, or I think of a carbon price more as an accelerator, as a pay-for, as opposed to a substitute. And so thinking about how a carbon price might interplay with other policies that we see as needed, I have a few. I was trying to sort of think of a few do's and don'ts. And a don't would be don't preempt local and state policies. We need all the experimentation and all the going further that the California and other states represent. I would not stop giving the solutions we want to see a leg up. So I wouldn't take away, for instance, tax incentives for wind and solar at this point, because we underestimate how much, even culturally, fossil fuels and the way that we do things now has an advantage, and it goes beyond an economic advantage. So I think we need belts and suspenders and buttons and snaps for all the good things we want to see. Do no harm. There are, depending on what the market mechanism, perverse ways in which shuffling around carbon can concentrate a lot of it in facilities that keep running in the most overburdened places. And if we were to roll back some regulations, we might see less monitoring, less transparency, less public participation. Those are so key to how we're going to achieve the social change that we need in the communities where that change has to happen. Beyond do no harm, do affirmative good. So someone said so beautifully how the climate solutions also are the ways to make the world better, and it was you. And how we get to some of the solutions of intractable problems that preceded our climate crisis. And so how do we target the goods of climate solutions to the communities that need them most, including economic transition in communities that have been so fossil dependent? That, I think, is something that can be compatible with carbon pricing, but it doesn't happen on its own. And whatever suite of policies it is, I think has to think about advancing those health, wealth, resilience benefits in the places where people, as Mary Nichols said this morning, are so sophisticated about the problems that they're living in and can be the most activated base of support for the kind of climate policies that we need. And so it's not just a climate imperative, it's not just a justice imperative, I think it's a political imperative to design our policies to advantage the people who can see the benefits that they need the most.
Great, thank you. Jerry, I want to turn to you and think, if we're thinking about what you might change in what you currently have, one of the important things is to think about kind of how effective is what you currently have, right? In some sense, if you're making that trade. And so how valuable do you see the existing authorities for regulating greenhouse gases, and how does that change how you think about things?
They're pregnant with usefulness, but they're not particularly useful right now. I mean, to give you an idea of where I think we so wildly exaggerate the regulatory authority we have as far as its practical impact, consider the Clean Power Plan. The Clean Power Plan was released by the Obama administration. It was designed to be as aggressive as the administration thought they could be, with a reasonable certainty of getting through judicial review, because they knew the lawsuits would rain down upon them from industry, which they did. So this pertained primarily to stationary sources in the electricity sector. And it was trying to push the boundary of what we could get away with in the Clean Air Act in that sector of the economy. And no less a source than the American Petroleum Institute said that the cost of the Clean Power Plan would likely be zero if we had low-cost natural gas and the projections that they thought was most likely. They believed the cost of the Clean Power Plan was probably zero. And less optimistic people, maybe at Resources of the Future, said, fine, it won't be zero, we don't think, but it won't have any cost until after 2025. And it will be a very trivial cost. So this is as ambitious as the Obama administration thought they can get away with in the electricity sector. And you're telling me trading that for a $35 or $40 carbon tax, something like that, would somehow be catastrophic? This is nuts. The existing regulatory regime, except for in a few places, like when it comes to CAFE, is basically a Potemkin village. So this is problem number one. And by the way, to give you an idea about the lack of will on this, there was a vote last week in the United States Senate to save the Clean Power Plan from the repeal that the Trump administration was executing, and 3 Democrats defected from that vote, from West Virginia, Alabama, and Arizona. So if you've got 3 Democrats who are afraid to vote for a regulatory statute that even the oil and gas industry probably has zero cost, that tells you how far away you are from getting the kind of ambitious policies we want. Now, let me, before I make you too depressed, we spend a lot of time at the Niskanen Center working with Republicans on the Hill because of the fact that a lot of my staff, like me, are expats from the libertarian world, so we know how to talk Republican, which means we can speak Russian. And so we know how to talk to them in libertarian and conservative framing. And there's a surprising amount of interest on the Republican side of the aisle for reasonably ambitious climate action if and when a legislative opportunity arises. One is not there right now because the Republicans own the Senate, Donald Trump's in the White House. This Congress is not a particularly functional Congress, and so no one's going to put a big target on their backs for Koch Industries, the coal industry, or Grover Norquist and the Club for Growth or something like that until they see a reasonable opportunity for success. But there's a lot more of that latent support than you'd think there, and so we've been working with these members to effect that jailbreak when that opportunity arises, which we're hoping will be after the general election in 2020. But anyway, in the course of dealing with Republicans, we're helping them think through policy design, what a carbon tax will look like beyond a messaging bill. I mean, how would you actually wrestle with border adjustments, things like that? And we've gotten a few bills out, by the way, on the Republican side of the aisle. There are 2 exclusively Republican-sponsored carbon tax bills that we've had a significant hand in helping them think through, as has EDF. There's a couple that are bipartisan with the Republicans and Democratic co-sponsors. And when we talk with these Republicans, we're leaning forward, and in the Senate there's probably about 10 of them, and in the House there's probably about 40, though those numbers will probably change after the 2020. They're not particularly interested in this regulatory trade-off. They're not. It hardly ever comes up. And in fact, the legislation that we've helped them put together, which defers to their own preferences, not our preferences, not in the business of selling our model carbon tax bill. We're in the business of helping them promote the kind of carbon tax legislation they want. There's very little regulatory trade here at all. What we have seen in those bills is a 12-year suspension wherever the tax drops. So if the tax is applying on the stationary sources, then there'll be a regulatory suspension there, but with a reconsideration. The main reason we do that is, as Rob would be the first to tell you, when you look at these modeling exercises, which try to examine how much emissions reduction you get from a given level of a carbon tax, the error bars are crazy. They're off the charts. We just don't really know that well. But if you think low carbon energy is economically competitive with fossil fuels right now in many sectors of the economy, and will continue to get more competitive, which is, I think, what most of us probably believe. If you believe that, then a low carbon tax will get you more emissions reductions than a lot of people suspect. It's only if low carbon energy technology is as far away from economic competitiveness as they would tell you at the Heritage Foundation or my old place of employment at the Cato Institute or at the Manhattan Institute or someplace like that. If that were true, yeah, then you're going to want regulatory authority because big carbon taxes won't give you much. I'm personally not particularly worried about that.
Rob, I want to come back to you almost on this last point, which is, one of the reasons people sometimes get very worried about any regulatory rollback at all. I think one set of reasons is the political side of, is this sending the wrong message? The other, though, is much more along the lines of, great, you put in place your carbon tax. Is that really going to get me what I need? And if not, I don't want to lose any tool at all. So how much certainty do we have? And how do you see that question of what would a carbon tax get us?
Every estimate out there says any kind of reasonable carbon tax, particularly one in the range that I'm proposing, is going to do way more to reduce emissions than all the regulations we have put together. So Chris Candela at MIT has a nice recent paper that you could replace all the major regulations from the Obama administration, CAFE, Clean Power Plan, there's one other I'm not remembering right now, with a $6 a ton carbon tax. And that's going off the RIA estimates, not more modern estimates that suggest those might be smaller. Now that goes up over time, but it still doesn't get anywhere near in the range of most carbon tax proposals. That's the first thing. Second thing, it's hard to think, I tried thinking of an example where a market-based policy has done less than people forecast ahead of time. The sulfur dioxide trading program, prices came in way below what they had originally forecast, that it did more at that price than anybody saw. You look at California, the price came in low. You look at the EU, the price came in low. You get that same phenomenon with a tax, it means the emissions reductions come in high. So we have yet to actually get one right. And every case, the market mechanism is more effective than people thought it would be. Third thing, the proposal that I've got includes an adjustment mechanism. If we're not hitting the targets, the tax rate goes up faster. If we're going way past the targets, it goes up slower. And that's a way of providing a little bit more certainty there. And then the other thing I'd say, I don't think you actually get that much emissions certainty out of regulations. If you wind up sort of coming back later, well, raise the price a little bit. It's going to be more efficient. The regulations I'm talking about taking out are not the local air quality regulations or anything like that. They're regulations that are really being supplanted by a carbon price. And if you want to go further, just put in a higher carbon price. I recognize politically that could be challenging, but the regulations are challenging too. So,
I want to come to that second point, Christy, which is, in some sense, the regulation cost side, right? Which is one of the great advantages of a price on carbon, whether it's a tax or, as Mary Nichols pointed out earlier, even just auctioning 10% of the allowances under California cap and trade has netted them $7 billion. And so a very handy thing about price mechanisms is you get money, and money's useful in this kind of world in terms of cushioning the blow to affected communities or doing other things that are pro-climate. And so how do you think about this kind of trade-off as you're looking at a longer run thing of a regulatory approach that may involve costs, but you don't get money to cushion the costs versus a price mechanism where you do?
Well, I would just say, I don't think it's an either or. We are going to have to do both. And looking at a carbon tax as a pay for rather than your primary source to drive down emissions is a different question. Yes, you will get emissions reductions even if you're at something like, any number, $15 per ton or lower, and then you can use that money for any number of aspects of the transition. And I don't know yet if that's a more politically palatable approach to considering the carbon tax, but I think it is a sequencing question of what are the benefits of this policy and how do we talk about it? And that's the question around the carbon tax. If we have a certain amount of money, shouldn't we be talking about, are we investing that in the infrastructure that the country needs? Are we investing that in the change that we need to see? Not, $75 per ton, not $100 per ton. It's what are the uses of the money that we will need, and how does that then pair with the regulatory framework that we're looking at? Because I think that's how you build support for the policies. I mean, the challenge we've seen in the practical sense at the state level is there's been a huge challenge, even in Washington state, in passing a carbon tax. It was on the ballot twice. Governor Inslee tried to put it through the legislature and failed there. And then he quickly came around after the failure through the legislature and was able to pass more of a standards approach, 100% clean power bill that had a lot of aspects about how they were going to direct tax credits towards high quality, good paying jobs, how they're going to start a cumulative impacts review of the state to look at communities that are most vulnerable. So looking at the whole suite of policies that are necessary to build political support, and that flew through the legislature. So I think I would just caution us to think that the carbon tax is going to happen first and that it's going to be enough to solve climate change. If we need to have a whole suite, then let's think about the ways that we have a broad suite of support amongst constituents as well. And that's not, unfortunately, just economists. We have to think beyond those folks who really are going to say, this is making my life better at the end of the day.
Great, thanks. Abigail, I want to think about one other issue. So one of the things Rob mentioned, and one of the reasons economists do consistently love a price on carbon, is this statement that, well, you'll do all the things that are sensible to do that cost less than the carbon price, right? So we know we'll do these things, and these will be the cost-effective things. So if we think we need to do a lot to reduce emissions, we'd rather do it in the cost-effective ways. And so what I wanted to think about is, if you're not making that your primary tool, how do you make sure you're not doing things that don't make any sense? And the example I always have in my head is, at one point in Montgomery County where I lived, there was a discussion of, well, we should just mandate every new house have solar panels on it. And there are a lot of trees in my neighborhood. In some places, you would want to put solar panels, but there are a lot of houses it makes no sense because they literally get no sunshine. And so how do we make sure, if we're focused on a regulatory approach or on using legal tools we have, whether it's by policymakers or by outside advocates using the law, how do we make sure we're doing things in a cost-effective way?
Well, I don't know that my premise is that everything has to be done through a regulatory approach. So I agree with everything Christy just said.
Yeah.
And I think that what it's going to cost us as a society to decarbonize across every sector begs for us to find the most cheap and easy solutions that we can. And so I would ask, with respect to any policy, does this policy make economic sense? What I would not assume is that the visible hand directs people in rational, responsible ways. So, so many of the places where we need to achieve transformation are monopoly utilities or their ilk that get a return on sometimes irrational investments. So many of the decisions that we made have hidden subsidies for the wrong decisions in them. So my point isn't let's not care about the economic efficiencies. It's let's recognize that a price on carbon will not solve all of the market failures, as I think many people have agreed today. And with each policy, let's think about all the ways in which industry is going to want to slow walk and game their compliance. Unfortunately, climate's kind of amazing in that you have, for once, sometimes a marriage of self-economic interest and action, so that polluting less can make economic sense too. But even in the most obvious examples, for instance, capturing methane and selling it, you have the industry avoiding that result. So this is a long way of saying, with every policy, don't assume the regulated the regulated entity or the taxed entity, is going to make the right, rational, economic decision that serves the public interest. And let's use all the tools that we have available to direct people in the right ways, getting to the results that we want that benefit the most people the fastest, because we don't even have 12 years. We have like 10 to have our carbon emissions.
Great, thanks. Jerry, I want to come back to something you were talking about a little bit of where you see the chance to actually get to a price on carbon if we did, and where you see, what type of path you see to getting one. Do you think it's something, so you mentioned you don't see it in the next year or two. Is it something that you think actually would be viable, or do you think that really we need to look more at the solutions discussed on the first panel or on other regulatory things as our near term, because it's not coming anytime soon?
Well, my assessment of the prospects for carbon pricing are no different from my assessments for the prospect of anything meaningful and ambitious. The odds for all of them are about the same place. It's not as if carbon taxation is really difficult, but a hyper Obama Clean Power Plan on steroids is passable. It's not like that. The real issue is whether, one, the Democrats will take the White House in 2020, because if Donald Trump is president, this conversation's moot. It's just moot. And it probably requires Democrats to take the Senate as well. Probably, though not necessarily. That is by no means a certainty of any kind. But assuming that kind of a blue wave sweep, then you have to assume that you've got probably about a 2-year window to pass something on climate, because the second 2 years of a first-term administration is not particularly that productive. Your political capital's up front. So is the environmental community in a position to move a climate bill pretty much right out of the gate that has been vetted, thought through, that they're not trying to do it on the fly, that can pass? I don't see a lot of signs of that. I don't see consensus in the environmental community about what the climate vehicle would be. Would it be a Waxman-Markey cap and trade part 2? Would it be a carbon tax focused effort? Would it be an industry-specific regulatory effort? Would it be a suite of something else? Right now, if you ask people like me and Christy and Nat in Washington, how they read it, each actor is going to tell you something different. If you're trying to put it together on the fly, like Hillary Clinton and Bill Clinton tried to put together their health care plan in 1993, then you'll fail. Just as the Republicans failed when they tried to put their health care plan together on the fly in the last Congress. You can't put meaningful and important legislation together on the fly. It requires years of spade work to get stakeholders comfortable, politicians comfortable, to get the policy design correct, to trial balloon enough things so you know what the political avenues are, because as much as many of us think we know the key to unlocking legislative success, we don't, because we're dealing with future congressmen and future senators with a terrain that is not today's terrain. And they're just things we're not going to know. So these things take a lot of time. If there was generally a consensus with regards to what kind of climate bill would come out of the gate in the next Congress, I'd feel differently. And we also don't know how much political capital the Democratic president's going to want to spend. I could imagine very different answers depending upon who gets that nomination. And it's not just a matter of, is it going to be a moderate or progressive? It's going to be, if it was, for instance, Kamala Harris is fairly progressive, though not as progressive as some in the race. But everything I hear from her at the campaign trail tells me this is not going to be a top priority, which means it's probably not going to get a lot of political capital, which tells me nothing's going to happen in the first term of a Kamala Harris administration. So a lot of this is going to depend, in my opinion, on what Republicans can plausibly accept. Because Democrats, the main blocking agent of climate action has been the Republican Party. Period, full stop, and end of story. So the real question is, what are Republicans going to embrace? Now, we can't really know until we know who the president is, what happened in 2020, whether Donald Trump is still controlling the party from Manhattan via tweet storms every day. We just don't know any of these things. But if you're asking me what policies they're most likely to embrace, well, there have been at least a handful of Republican bills to address climate in a very meaningful fashion, and they're all carbon tax bills. They're not other things. And then what is the main reason, in my opinion, on that, just to end it here, is that it's not so much special interest money that holds the Republican Party back, though that's a part of the story. The big part of the story is ideological dogma. And you're asking them to, one, accept Al Gore was right, that's a heavy lift, and two, gosh, I guess we need to hire a lot of EPA regulators. Yeah, that's just asking too much for them. But even though carbon taxes are hard too, the Republicans weren't put on this earth to impose taxes, Milton Friedman argued this was the preferred remedy for pollution. Milton Friedman. And ExxonMobil will now tell them that as well, as will the head of the Mercatus Center, which is the most prominent Koch-funded think tank in the country, and their president, Tyler Cowen, is an extremely vocal and outspoken supporter of carbon taxes, though he wouldn't be a vocal and outspoken supporter for, an EPA-driven approach.
Okay, great, thank you.
Can I just jump
Yeah,
in on
please.
before you go? I just want to, what Jerry just described is what keeps me up at night from that question, the fact that you'd get a different answer about what the solutions are on the Democratic side. It is absolutely correct that legislation and vetting legislation and building constituencies is hard to do, and it's hard work, which is why looking at what California started several years ago, and now more than 9 states, including DC and Puerto Rico, have passed at the legislature. So their actual state representatives have voted on standard type bills that include some types of complementary policies is a short-term roadmap that we could look at that politicians have supported, governors have put forward, and state legislatures have acted on, even in places like New Mexico and Colorado. So I think we have to look at that progress that has been pretty extraordinary over the past 2 years at the state level and see how we can take that momentum and bring it to the federal level. Not that I have an answer exactly on how to do that, but it hasn't been a carbon tax.
Great. These are a lot of great questions, and we're not going to get to most of them, which I apologize. But let me run through a few of them quickly. Rob, one person asked a question that I think is relevant to you. It says, Mary Nichols mentioned that the carbon pricing in California hasn't really affected the transportation sector much. And I wanted your thought on that, because I thought I noticed your face make a reaction when that was brought up. And so,
there's a presumption among non-economists that you want to be pushing down emissions by the same amount in every sector. And there are some sectors where it's really cheap to cut emissions, and there's some sectors where it's really expensive to cut emissions. And if you put in a carbon tax, and if drivers are making reasonable, rational decisions, and they choose not to react very much, that suggests it's really costly for them to react. And if your reaction to that is, all right, then we have to force them to do something really costly, that's going to be politically unpopular, and B, it's going to be a much more expensive approach than having a price that gets you to do way more in the cheap sectors and less in the expensive sectors. So, and I sort of,
Transportation, though, is the leading source of emissions right now. So
Yeah.
so what does that suggest? Then you don't.
Well, it suggests that you decarbonize other places first. And you have you get a price in place, and you see what it does, and if it doesn't go far enough, you raise the price.
But if you know you have to get to zero emissions before mid-century, doesn't it suggest, if the problem isn't amenable to the taxing solution, doesn't it suggest you need something complementary?
What it suggests is, it may suggest, I would push back, this is probably not the place for it, but I would push back on we have to get to zero by mid-century. That I don't think arbitrary targets, but
to be clear, that was put out by the IPCC, so this is not an arbitrary target. It's a scientific body.
It's a scientific body that is going way beyond. That's not a scientific decision. That's a value decision. And science can tell you here's what the consequences will be if you have a certain amount of carbon emissions, but it can't tell you this is the right level.
But we had a conversation about the sectors that we don't even know what the solutions are. The industrial sector, we don't even know what the path is. Agricultural sector, we don't know what the path is. And so you think about the places where you do know where beneficial electrification with clean power will work, for instance. Why wouldn't we be going all in on those places where we know we have the technologies?
I think we should be going all in on the places where it's cheapest and doing less in the places where it's expensive. And I mean, a price is not, we've discussed all day, a price is not the only thing you need. You need some other stuff on top of that. But at least for the places where there aren't other market failures, the price is going to get you to do a lot more in the places where it's cheap.
It's so hard to talk about what's cheap when we're just learning how expensive climate change is.
But
if I can jump in, I think what's being missed here is there's a political dynamic. If for instance, a steep carbon price is doing very little to incent electric vehicles in the auto market, this is just a high if-then. If that's the case, then it means even steep and increasing fuel prices are not changing market behavior. And then your answer is, well, we're just going to mandate EVs on Detroit and on foreign auto sales. And we're going to treat them like CAFE, right? And have escalating percentages of EV purchase requirements. How do you think that's going to go over politically? I mean, I don't know if you've noticed the rebellion over light bulbs, which is a much smaller matter than a rebellion over the fact that people can't get SUVs anymore. They got to ride these EVs.
Who's
I mean,
driving
it's
the rebellion over light bulbs? It's
my
the
point
person
here-
that doesn't like the way it makes him look.
You know what? I got to tell you, I've got light bulbs in my house that are at issue as well. They ain't that hot. I mean, there is a reason why they're on the right. People will freak out about this stuff. It doesn't become any easier just because you regulate it. In fact, it becomes a lot harder for the reasons that Rob mentioned.
I want to come to you, Jerry, but everyone can hop in as well. There's one question just about if you were, because I think many of us have said, even if it's not the only thing you're doing, a carbon price is going to be in here somewhere as a likely part of a tool towards an aggressive path, which is if you were to do it via tax, what would that look like? How would you actually go about implementing it? And in particular, what do you do about kind of lower income communities or lower income households or more affected communities? How do you manage that?
Well, you can, if you've got an access to Google, go to the Market Choice Act by Congressman Rooney, and it's about a 45-page bill where it's been all thought out and designed, and you can geek out to your heart's content about how you design it. But the bills are all going to look a little bit differently because there are a lot of options with regards to policy design. But virtually, I think not just virtually, every single carbon tax bill I've seen introduced compensates low-income households. Mm-hmm. They vary in the degree to which they compensate them. In other words, are we just talking the first 2 quintiles? Are we talking the first 3 quintiles? Are we talking just first quintile? Most are the first 2 quintiles. So if you are low income, you get more from the compensation than you're probably paying in the tax. So it's a progressive tax, not a regressive tax, given the policy design. So little things like that are important. How you use the revenue is important to many, though utterly unimportant to me. I mean, if your objective is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, then the key consideration is to price them accordingly. It just so happens that if you do that, you get a lot of money. What you do with the money is an entirely separate question. And in an ideal world, I guess with all the economists sitting, you'd say, the ideal answer is put it in the Treasury and treat it like any other money the government gets and spend it as you need to. It's probably not the most politically acceptable answer. So, what you do with it should be just a matter of, I don't know, whatever politics demands we do with it. If carbon pricing and reducing the impact of global warming is our main criteria. And one of the things that frustrates me about this debate is that so far, carbon tax advocates have been blowing themselves up over and over again on what to do with the money. It was the main disagreement in the 2 Seattle ballot initiatives that harmed them. Lines in the sand are being drawn all over the place on this topic, both from people in my community. I know some organizations who are on the eco-right who say, well, if you use the revenues for this, that, or the other, it's good. You use the revenues for something else, then it's rank socialism, and I'll oppose. And then on the progressive communities as well. Well, if you're not handling social justice concerns and housing, and the Green New Deal was all about all of these other things that need to be addressed in climate policy, then we don't want to have any conversation. And to me, that tells me you're just not taking climate change as seriously as you're telling me you're taking it, because all these other considerations are more driving.
If I can jump in quickly on bringing this back to regulations a little bit, it's worth noting regulations don't raise money, so you don't have money to give back, and a lot of regulations are pretty regressive, that they're putting a bigger burden on poor people than wealthy people. And I mean, not just regulations, but complementary policy, paying rich people to drive Teslas. That's not just a cost-ineffective way of cutting emissions, it's also a really regressive way. So we need to think not just about sort of how progressive or regressive a carbon tax is, or carbon price in general, but also what the alternative is. And a lot of the alternatives are pretty regressive.
I've got just a few minutes left, and so I've got I just want to get to one more question before we wrap up, because I think it's a quick one, and it's something, Rob, you mentioned very quickly, which is that one of the things you would dismantle among the dismantling is actually not a kind of a pro-climate regulation, but you would dismantle all the subsidies to the fossil fuel industry as well as part of this. And so one of the questions that was posed was, why haven't we done that already? And is there anything other than politics holding that back, was the question. So I don't, just a quick from anyone on the panel as to, is there any reason we haven't done that?
No.
Yeah, that's an easy one. Politics.
Politics.
Okay.
Politics.
That was what I thought, but I thought it was a very good question to wrap before we go to kind of final comments. It's also nice to see universal agreement across the group on that. I want to wrap up giving people, we just got a few minutes left, just kind of closing thoughts on where you see kind of the potential for how we set up our climate policy, knowing we need to get somewhere far more ambitious than we are today. And maybe we'll just go kind of down this order if you want to start, Jerry.
Well, let me move that just a little bit and tell you what won't happen, is using existing regulatory authority to get there. There's not enough of it. It is too subject to legal wrangling. And if you think, I mean, any meaningful climate rule that comes out of a Democratic EPA after 2020 is going to be sued 20,000 ways from Sunday, and the people hearing the cases are increasingly Trumpian right-wing Republican judiciary. So, one, good luck trying to do anything particularly ambitious with the judges you're going to get. Two, good luck acting in time. It took 19 years since, in 1990, we passed the Clean Air Act with new source review standards, one of the most important parts of that law. And it wasn't until 2009 when the most important parts of the new source review standards were actually finalized. 19 years. Because regulation doesn't happen in a day. It takes years to draft a final rule. Then you got comment periods. Then you've got back and forth. Then you're going to have lawsuits, and then you're going to have stays. It takes an eternity to move important things through the regulatory process. And if we really have only X amount of time, we don't have time for that. We need to act legislatively.
Great. Abigail?
If I thought the debate were between an effective legislative solution at the federal level and the Clean Power Plan, I think the answer would be very easy for all the reasons that you've suggested. But what I have heard this debate about is, if you have a right price on carbon, what else is needed, if anything? And I'm suggesting, I think it's so hard to imagine the political space in which we get a right or even good price on carbon in the near future. And so the discussion around, is it this perfect policy or that policy, feels disconnected from what we need to be doing right now, which is getting the intensity of enough people who are demanding even the sort of half-perfect policy you suggested, Jerry. And I think that we need to be focusing on climate results and a suite of policies that clearly speak to a whole group of people that come together for climate action. And I hope that includes some Republicans.
Great. Christy?
I think for me, it's a sequencing question. We have seen, as was mentioned in the first panel, that there's been a huge jump, especially with Democratic primary voters, in the saliency of climate action. That's why every single major candidate on the Democratic side has put out ambitious plans that pretty much all embrace the net zero by 2050 target. So we also know the public wants action. They want it to match the science, and they want it to be realistic. So first, we have to have agreement on what those targets are and where we're headed, and then the policies that come in after that are going to have to be ongoing, and a carbon tax will be a part of that, but I would bet it's not going to be the first thing we do.
So I'm kind of skeptical about the targets. I mean, we've been setting targets and missing them for a long time. And so I'm not sure I know what the solution is. But I don't think that approach has worked, and I think trying something different would be useful. The other thing, I mean, you know, what do we do after a price on carbon? I I mean, there's a certain fictional, I mean, I've always wanted to be a science fiction author and got to write the paper here. But it is, I mean, there is some possibility of that. And I think it's worth, even if you're not going to get it, it's worth thinking about what the ideal policy looks like. But I also think nobody should be holding out for their ideal policy, that we need to do something, we need to do something now. We really need to do something, it would have been much better to do something decades ago. And going for, I'd love it if we can get the ideal policy, but if it's the second best or the third best or the fourth best or the fifth best, as long as it's better than the status quo, which is a pretty low bar, it's a step in the right direction. And so I think that should be the focus. How we get there, I mean, the choice I made is to focus on trying to win over Republicans. That's the choice Jerry's made. Rather than trying to get so many Democrats behind something you can just roll the Republicans. I'm not sure that's, I mean, I understand the economics a lot better than the politics. But I hope that works. Thanks.
Thanks. I'd like to just, before we wrap, just once again, thank Stanford for co-hosting with us here today, and thank all the panelists and authors for a terrific event. And I'd like to have all you join me in thanking this terrific panel that wrapped us up here today.